Right, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are, and thanks for attending this session. Basically, this presentation really is going to talk about installing Zebra licenses primarily on EMC devices, the mobile computing devices. And this is really coming from a user point of view or an integrator point of view. The actual license infrastructure is quite complex, and this doesn't attempt to try and explain anything about that. It's really talking about how you would practically get a license onto a device using different methods. So basically, in terms of an overview, what you probably have seen is that our products require separate licenses for different applications. And one thing that's kind of focused attention on this is that with the newer products that we're releasing, such as the TC21, TC26, in order to get access to the full MDNA feature set, you need to install an MDNA enterprise license. So whereas previously, we've had other products which need a license like Enterprise Browser, PTT Express, for example, those tend to be fairly specific use cases, whereas for the newer products like the 21, 26, and also the upcoming 2200, 2700, I think a lot of customers are going to require the additional MDNA features which require the license to be installed. So, it's probably the case that the requirement to install a license is going to increase significantly with the release of these products. And that's really why we're trying to get information out into the field as to how to do that. The licenses themselves can be either perpetual, which is a permanent license, or time limited in terms of either months or years. So depending on the model that you choose, you can either renew the license on a yearly basis, for example, or if you want to make life easy, then you can have a perpetual license, which will be valid for the lifespan of the device. And the licenses themselves are purchased using a product code and then delivered via an entitlement ID, which you can redeem through the licensing portal. And that's the URL for the production portal. There are two versions of the portal. One is for production and one is for test or UAT. So the entitlement ID itself links to one or more activation IDs, and the activation ID is the code you actually need to activate a license on a device. When you use an activation ID with the cloud server option on a new device, the device ID, which is the identifier, the unique identifier for that particular device, is automatically inserted into the license server database. And that's useful because it avoids a potential issue whereby if you manually enter a device ID and you enter something even slightly incorrectly, so you miss out a digit or you put a lowercase alpha instead of an uppercase, then that prevents that license from being accepted on the target device, because it has to have 100% match between the device ID on the device and the device ID that's been included in the license. So it is actually a good idea if you have the option to initially license through the cloud server, even if you're going to then subsequently deploy it on a non-connected device. That's a screenshot of a TC57 in this case, and you can see the device ID. It's basically a combination of the model name and then an underscore and the serial number. So it's not complicated really, but you need to, as I say, make sure that that device ID is the one that's used when you license a device on the server side. And this screen comes from the License Manager app, which is pre-installed on the device, and you can run License Manager, go to Settings, About, and you'll see the device ID in that screen. Licenses can be both allocated and returned to the server using the License Manager app. So we're going to look at a live demo shortly, and I'll show you how the options for doing that. but you can also use the MX License Manager CSP, which is included in the current versions of Stage Now. And that allows you to, rather than to do it manually by running License Manager and selecting the option through the UI, you can also do it programmatically, either through a Stage Now barcode profile, or if you export the XML, you can also push that to the device through an EMM tool such as SOTI or VMware. And as I mentioned, the license server is either production or test, also known as UAT. When you return the license, you have to return it to the same source as it was provisioned from, which makes sense. So if it comes from the production server initially, it has to be returned to that server. And in this talk, we're going to talk about or cover 3 different license methods. Offline licensing, which requires no network connection once it's deployed. So that's useful in that typically a lot of our customers either don't have internet connectivity or they may not have much connectivity at all on certain devices. So in this case, the idea is that once you deploy the license onto the device, it doesn't need to have any network connection, whether it's intranet or internet. It's basically got a license file installed on the device itself. And that can make life a lot easier. Second option is cloud server. So this requires a network connection to the Flexera, which is the license infrastructure provider, internet hosted license server. So that normally requires a path through the firewall, and we talk about which ports and which address you need to enable for that to work. And the third option is a local server, which requires a network connection to a locally hosted license server. So those are basically the 3 options. First one, offline licensing. So licenses which you create on the server side can be downloaded as bin files, so a binary file, and deployed to the device for a completely offline licensing solution. In this case, you require 1 bin file per device, but the bin file can contain multiple product licenses in a single file. So if I have a TC26, I can have both an MDNA enterprise license and an enterprise browser license included in the same single bin file. And it works best with perpetual licenses, because if you use a temporary license, then you will need to replace it when it's expired, because obviously you don't have an ongoing connection to the server. So once the license expires, then it would need to be updated by installing a new bin file. So for that reason, if you've got a time-limited license, then the cloud server automatic deployment method may be preferred. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. But basically, that will support automatic renewal of the licenses, either by rescanning the license activation barcode or by performing a reset. So I created a blog, which is at that link on our developer portal, and that covers the method for doing offline licensing by deploying a bin file. There's an unofficial, so use at your own risk utility, which I've called licenser.exe, and that basically is just a helper to simplify the download and the deployment of the bin file. So it doesn't really do very much apart from just assist with accessing that file and getting it onto the device. And the same technique can be applied to license the Zebra FX RFID readers using a modified version of that utility called FX Licenser. And we'll look at that briefly as well in an upcoming slide. So the license utility, licenser.exe, is, as I said, is just a utility to simplify management and deployment of offline licenses. It uses the activation, or you can use the activation ID field to paste the activation ID and generate a barcode, which is in this case a data matrix code, which you can use to easily scan that activation code into the license manager app on the device. So rather than having to key it, in which case you may get a transcription error, it's much easier to scan that activation ID, and that's just a helper to do that. It also has the ability to query the device through an ADB connection in order to get its device ID. So again, you don't need to manually transcribe that. And it will then guide you through logging onto the server, downloading the bin file for this particular device, pushing it to the device, and then installing it through this StageNow barcode. So yeah, it's really just going to help to simplify this process, especially if you had, a significant number of units to license. So going to show you that actually running the utility itself. So as I said, if I cut and paste a license activation ID into this field and hit barcode, that exact text will be encoded in this barcode. And so when you scan it on the device, then you can activate that license. I have a TC26 connected to my machine. Hopefully you can see the screen here. So if I just show you the license manager utility, so this is run from the zconfigure program group, license manager. And as I said, if you go to settings about, then you can see my device ID here, NEN416. And I already have one license installed, which is the Mobility DNA license. That, as you can see, is a trial license, and it's expiring on the 15th of November. So that's a temporary license, which is time-bound and fairly short expiry. So what I'm going to do really is first just to query the device. So I hit the query button, and then when I hit load, what should happen is that it should give me my device ID. Okay, thank you. So that should match what I have in my settings. Well, you can see it's got ending 416, so it is the same device ID. And at that point, I can then choose between test and production. So in most cases, as a partner, you'll be using the production server, but internally we use the test server. So what I'm going to use here. So I can just hit Flexero logon, just opens up a browser with the logon to the test server. And if I use my SSO, I can sign on. And that will take you to the home page of the license portal. So if I go back to the utility and hit download bin, then it will download the actual offline license that's already assigned to this device. So in order to see what licenses I've got, I can just copy my device ID, go to devices, hit the devices link, and in the, so I just copy and paste my device ID, which is my device name, and hit search. See, there's thousands of devices on here, so I need to be able to find the specific device, which is this one. So I just hit the link to see the details, and you can see I've got one MDNA evaluation license installed. So if I want to install another license, add another product, I can say map by activation ID, and I can already cut and paste my activation ID. I've got that saved here. So paste that in, hit validate. It's going to tell me if that's a valid activation ID, and it is, and it's an enterprise browser temporary license. I change the quantity to add to 1, otherwise it's going to allocate all my licenses to one device, which I don't want to happen. So hit save, and at that point then it should have added that to my list of licenses. So I've now got 2 products licensed. And at that point, I could either manually say download capability response, and that will give me the bin file, or I can go back to the helper utility and just say download bin, and that will just go directly to that link to download that binary file. So at that point, I say save as. I need to make sure I put this file into the same folder as the licensing utility executable, because it's going to look in the same folder for any license files. So I just hit save, place the version that's there, close, and now all I need to do is say push, and that's going to, using ADB, is going to push that binary file to the device, and then go back to my device and run stage now, and then whoops, let's go back to that. Got too many windows open. Try and move that. Okay, so if I now scan this stage now license, what should happen is that it will basically, using the license manager CSP, it will install that binary file that's been pushed to the device, and you should see that reflected then in terms of the licenses that I have available on the device. So I run license manager again, and you can see now it's added the enterprise browser evaluation license. So it's pretty easy to do that, and it's really, this just simplifies that process if you want to use offline licenses. So let me just see if I can get back to the slides. I was going to mention also that you can, I've got dodgy cable here, but you can, if you want to return that license, you can just say, hit the 3-dot menu, say return license, and to select the same license source, which is the test cloud, and then hit return, and that will basically return that license to the pool. And if I wanted to allocate it again, if I just refresh that window, you'll see that should now only have the MDNA license listed. So I can then map it again if I want to add it again. And you should see that the total number of licenses was back to 54. So when I deployed it, it went down to 53. And when I returned it, went back up to 54. So it is a license pool that you can use. So I've just activated that again. And I can, this time I'll do it manually, but I can download the capability response to save as, put it into my working folder, and then go back to here, push the file again, go back to the screen of the device. Where's that gone? Okay, it's there. On stage now again. And then go back to license manager and you see it back again. So you have a pool of licenses that you can use to potentially you can return them to in order to deploy them on a different device. So let's go back to the slides. So with this method, once deployed, the license bin file will be installed until the device is reset. So it's going to be always there, regardless of what connectivity it has. There's no subsequent check of the server for the license. And as I said, the bin file in that case was pushed to the device via ADB and installed using the license manager CSP. If you've got a time-limited license, just to note that you have a 30-day grace period, which you'll see in this case. You can see here I've got a license that actually expired on the 6th of October, And this screenshot was taken today. So you can see it's basically given me 30 days in total, and I've got 23 days left. And after that period of time, then the license will become inoperable. So it does give you a 1 month window to renew a license if it's expired on the device. As I say, that probably one of the drawbacks of offline licensing is that you would need to deploy the bin file again with a revised license activation ID in order to be able to refresh that license. And I mentioned we can do the same with the FX RFID readers. So they use the same licensing system, but in a slightly different process. You know, the device ID is a different format where you've got the model number, in this case an FX7500, and then underscores between each 2 digits of the MAC address of the reader. So it's completely different format to what we're using with the mobile computing products. But apart from that, you know, you can still license the device using that device ID, and you can still do the same kind of thing. We do a log on to the either the test or the production server, download the bin file contains the license, and the license would be for FX Connect, I should mention. So by default, when you have an FX7500 or 9600, FX Connect, which is an enhanced communications capability, is not licensed. It's not available. And once you install the FX Connect license, then you'll be able to use the FX Connect feature set. So the installation itself is done through the reader browser interface. So within the browser interface, you can go to the licensing option, and then you can acquire the license either online or offline. And if you select offline, you can browse, use the browse button to browse for the bin file that you've downloaded from the server, and then that will install that on the reader. And again, from that point onwards, it doesn't need to have an internet connection or a network connection. So that's offline licensing. The next option is cloud licensing, and this requires connectivity to the internet using HTTP, HTTPS. So these are the URLs and the IP addresses and the ports which would need to be accessible through a firewall if you want to use cloud licensing. So on a WAN unit, typically it's quite straightforward in that unless you've got a private APN, then you'll have internet connectivity and you'll be able to reach the server. But on a Wi-Fi unit, then probably you need to configure the firewall to allow access to those addresses. And in the case of a deployment, you'd only need the production server. You wouldn't need to have access to the UAT. That would only be for test. And you can also use a forward or reverse proxy server in the case the device needs to go through a proxy to reach the outside world. And there's a reference at that link to setting up the proxy. So in terms of cloud licensing manually, then you can just do pretty much what we talked about, which is that you can enter or scan the license activation ID, select the cloud or the production server, and hit activate. And at that point, it will connect to the cloud server, and it will check that there are licenses available for that activation ID. And if there are, it will deploy them onto the device. So you can use that licensing utility to generate the barcode in order to scan that in. All you have to do is hit the plus button in order to get to this screen where you can enter the license activation ID. And then you'll see immediately if it's successful, it will add the license. Otherwise, it will give you hopefully a useful error message. If you want to do that automatically, then you can use the License Manager CSP in Stage Now. And so to do that, you create an expert profile in the Stage Now, select License Manager as the step, And then in the license action, well, firstly, perform Zebra license action that needs to be enabled. You can select Activate AID as the license action. You select your cloud source. So use one of the Zebra licensing cloud options. You can select either the test cloud or the production cloud. You then enter the activation ID for the license that you want to deploy. Leave the quantity as 1, and then generate the Stage Now barcode or the NFC tag to deploy that license onto a device. So that's pretty straightforward, and that will work provided you have connectivity to the cloud server. And you can also make this profile persist over an enterprise reset, but just by adding a persist manager step to the end of the profile, which persists any previous steps in the profile. So the only caveat with that is that you need to have a Wi-Fi connection pre-configured if you don't have a WAN unit, because it needs obviously to have a Wi-Fi connection in order to connect to the server. There's some examples of doing this. If you want to have a look at pre-built profile, I've put one at that link, and the XML that's included in that profile is at that link. So you can look at both the raw XML and the Stage Now profile. And the only point to note is if you are persisting a cloud server installation via Wi-Fi, then you need to put in a step to wait for a usable IP connection before requesting a license. So if you don't do that, then it tries to request the license too quickly before it's actually established the IP, the Wi-Fi connection, and got an IP address. And in that case, it fails normally. So what we do is to add a condition manager step in the profile, which does a loop of 15 iterations, checking for an IP address, so that it gives it enough time for the device to boot up, configure the Wi-Fi, connect to the network, get an IP address served before it tries to do the actual license action. Other points to note: when you persist a cloud server installation, make sure the profile is installed last after any other persistent profiles. So if you have more than one persistent profile, this one needs to be the last in the order, which means that you need to give the persisters order value a high number, so that basically that means any persistent profiles with a lower value will be executed first before this one. So giving it a high number like 99 will make sure it's at the end of the list of profiles which will be executed after the device reboots. If your network connection fails after reboot, then the license won't be reapplied. So you either need to reapply the profile through Stage Now, or reboot the device again when you've got a network connection. So if you had a Wi-Fi network outage, then you'd need to basically wait for the network to be available again and then repeat the reboot or reapply the profile. And then finally, last option, local license server. Personally, I don't really recommend this because it requires quite a lot of heavy lifting to set up, but it is there as an option. You would require a Windows machine, Windows 10, Java 8 or 11, Apache Tomcat. Network for the host computers got to allow direct connections to that fixed IP address. And the local license server can also be registered for offline use. So normally the way it would work is that the local license server would connect to the license server in the cloud in order to validate a license. But if you don't have that connectivity, you can set up so it downloads and stores licenses locally. But as I say, it is there as an option, but it does require quite a lot of setup and configuration. So you would really only use it in cases where, for whatever reason, the cloud or the offline option wasn't available.